and I'd like to welcome you all to this number 105 of the Circle of Wine Writers Let's Talk About sessions. The series was founded during COVID in 2020 and has come quite a long way since then, in the safe hands of Liz Saggies and Michelle Shah. I'd like to extend a welcome, obviously, to our members joining these sessions for the first time and also to non-members. The Circle was founded in 1960 in the UK, and we are now around 270 members, wine writers, broadcasters, educators, and other professional communicators. We're about 50-50 now across the world, 50% the UK and 50% overseas. You can find more information about the Circle via our website. And if you'd like to join our mailing list to attend future tastings or events, then please do let us know and we will add you to that list. So now I'd like you to hand you over to Michelle Shah, who will introduce Alder Yarrow, who today is going to talk about behind the scenes at the Old Registry. Over to you, Michelle.
Thank you, Andrea, and hi to everybody and welcome back after the summer break. So I'm delighted to welcome back Alder Yarrow, fellow Circle member who has previously presented on the Let's Talk sessions. Described by San Francisco magazine as the wine world's biggest cyberstar, Alder is a pioneer, wine blogger, author, and columnist for JancesRobinson.com. And in conjunction with Jancis Robinson and her team, Alder set up the Old Vines Registry, the world's first and most authoritative database of old vine vineyards around the globe. So as Andrea said, in this session, Alder will explain the story behind the database and describe how it was built and how it is evolving. And thank you very much, Alder, for making time to be with us today. And over to you.
It's my great pleasure. Good afternoon, good morning. Happy to see everybody and really looking forward to the conversation today. I'm going to go ahead and share some slides that I've got put together. I would, however, love for this to be a conversation as we go along. I can't watch the chat and present at the same time, but if somebody wants to pull themselves off mute and ask a burning question as we go through, you're more than welcome to do that. This is going to be perhaps the most in-depth conversation that I've ever had about the Old Vines Registry. We've done some webinars and some seminars previously to announce the launch of the registry and then on at its 1-year anniversary, but I've never really gone into depth as to what's going on behind the scenes. And so that's the intent with today's conversation, which is to say we're going to get as geeky as you want to get and maybe as geeky as I want to get about the registry, and hopefully you'll learn something and come away with a deeper understanding of what's gone into this. Briefly, however, I want to add to the wonderful introduction that Michelle gave me, not so much about the wine stuff that I do, but about the not wine stuff that I do, because in addition to being a wine writer and a critic, I've had a nearly 3-decade-long career as a consultant in the user experience design and strategy space for the web. Core part of my career was spent at a company called Sapient Corporation, which is now part of the big marketing conglomerate Publicis. And in 2005, I started my own agency in San Francisco, focused on customer experience design and strategy, and ran that until 2018 when I sold it to a larger agency. But in the course of running that agency, I've put together teams that have designed apps and websites and digital products and strategies to go along with that for lots of big global companies whose names you've heard of. Suffice it to say that designing and building websites from sort of vision to daily maintenance and ongoing use is part and parcel of how I've paid the bills for the last 25 years or so. So that was in part sort of what brought me to be able to be the person that brought this Old Vines Registry from beginning to end. So just quickly, I assume most people are familiar with it, but the Old Vines Registry is a public crowdsourced database. So public as in anybody can access it, crowdsourced meaning that the data that feeds it and that it contains have come from lots of different sources around the world, focused on old vine vineyards around the world. It's accessible on the website, oldvineregistry.org. At the moment, we have 3,462 vineyards representing 38 different countries containing roughly 591 discrete grape varieties and counting. I get a little addition every day or two. Somebody sends something new into the registry, whether it's a new vineyard or a correction to
good.
something that's already there.
I know, I'm just listening.
Well, somebody's should go on mute. And in addition to being a publicly accessible website, this is also quite deliberately an open source data set of the above, which is to say that if anybody ever wants all the data that's behind the Old Vine Registry, they can simply send an email and they can get it and use it as they see fit. So together, those two things, we believe, provide an opportunity to connect people to Old Vine wines and the people and places that produce them. And I want to go into that just a little bit more. So why does this registry exist in the first place? Well, because we believe knowledge is valuable and knowledge repositories are useful. And specifically with regards to old vines, you can't protect what you don't know about. There's this idea that unless we can actually get our arms around the extent of the old vine vineyards in the world, we can't really do anything about keeping them alive, keeping them in the ground, keeping them productive, and valuing what they represent for the world of wine. And I don't need to tell this attendant group the value of old vines in general. But also, we believe that both a literal and a figurative link needs to be made between the vineyards and the people who farm them and keep them alive, and the people who might want to taste what those vineyards are capable of producing. And it's closing that commercial loop that we believe is really valuable. And I'll talk a little bit about how we're trying to do that with the Old Vine Registry. The other reason to create the Old Vine Registry is simply because no one else is doing it. We have societies that support old vines around the world, whether it's the Barossa Old Vine Charter or the Old Vine Project in South Africa. But there's nobody that's actually trying to create this catalog, or there wasn't nearly 16 years ago or something like that when Jancis and team first got the idea. And so that's how we begin. More explicitly, what are we trying to do with the existence of this website? And so these are our actual explicit, created, defined, chartered objectives of the existence of this project, which is to create a permanent, public and database-driven repository for the Old Vine Registry that is more flexible and powerful than the Excel spreadsheet that this thing was for more than a decade. We wanted to make the registry more searchable and more accessible to the worldwide wine industry, provide a destination that we could send people to promote the registry, provide a call to action where we could solicit contributions of data. After all, this is a crowdsourced effort, so we have to get access to the crowd. We want to provide a means to drive purchases of the wines made from these old vines in order to support the people that farm them and care for them. And we want to make this data set available to anybody to drive the greatest benefit of all for the entire industry. Let me pause there before I get into exactly how this thing came into existence. That's sort of just an overview of what the OVR is, why it exists, and what we're trying to do with it. And I'm going to go into now sort of how it came to be, how it evolved from a spreadsheet that Jancis had on her laptop to the state of the website that it is today, and then get into some nitty-gritty of how the whole thing was constructed, etc. Any questions before we go on? All right, so in 2010, Jancis and Tam decided, hey, we keep writing about old vine vineyards. Wouldn't it be neat to kind of keep track of these things? So they started keeping track of the old vine vineyards that they were aware of on a spreadsheet. And for the next decade, they kept adding to it. Every time they ran across a producer or went to a tasting or whatever, they'd keep track of what was going on. And they got it up to about 800 lines in this spreadsheet. And then in 2020, a guy in the Netherlands, who's an Alsace specialist, a guy named Benjamin Rolfe, decides to raise his hand and say, hey, this is a really interesting project you guys are doing with this Old Vine Registry. I'd like to help. And he goes to town, rolls up his sleeves, just becomes a spreadsheet wrangler, and he manages to add another 1,000 vineyards in the space of about a year, including soliciting some large chunks of data from some institutional and organizational players that I'll mention in a moment. And so at about 1,800 lines, this spreadsheet was starting to get pretty unwieldy. It was inconsistent. There were lots of gaps in it. It was hard to manage. And, Jancis and team were just providing this literally as a downloadable PDF on the website. And that wasn't super useful to anybody, especially at that size. And so Jancis just happens to make an offhand comment in the course of her article talking about the latest update that's been made to this spreadsheet, asking if basically there's anybody else out there in the world that's a database designer that wants a job that won't pay anything and wants to, turn this spreadsheet into a website. And I saw that and I was like, I think I actually know somebody who knows how to do that. And so I raised my hand and said, look, I think I can make this happen. And at the time I was advising a startup called Pix, whose CEO I knew well, and who was very interested in both for the benefit to the wine industry as well as for the benefit to their business model of aggregating this kind of data to and make it available in a digital form. Pix was essentially going to be a competitor to Wine Searcher. And so the CEO, Paul Mabray, said, yeah, Alder, if you want to manage this thing, Pix will pay for it. And so around about that time, Jancis Robinson had sold her website to Recurrent. And so we said, all right, we're going to build this thing, but we don't want this to be owned by your new parent company, Jancis. And she said, yes, no, we definitely need this to keep it separate. It wasn't ever intended to be part of jancisrobinson.com necessarily. And so we reached out to Sarah and Belinda at the Old Vine conference and said, hey, this thing that we're thinking about building needs a home, and you're the most likely home for it. Would you be willing to own this? And they said, of course, we'd love to do that. You can sort of have it be under our umbrella. And so with their help, we sort of put together what I call the fellowship of the registry. So it's Sarah and Belinda and myself and Benjamin and Tam and Jancis, kind of the core group of folks that were responsible for and wanted to shepherd this thing and bring it to life in a new form. And we got going. So the first thing to do, of course, was to figure out, well, what is it that we're going to build? And so this is where I kind of kick into my day job hat. I kind of take the wine hat off and put on the day job hat and say, all right, well, if we're going to build a website, here's the way you build a website. The first thing you do is you create a project brief that all the different stakeholders can look at and say, yep, that's what we want to build. So that's what I did. Just a one-page project brief that says, this is what we're going to do. We're going to build this website. This is what it's going to be for. This is what it's going to have on it. Everybody agreed to that. Everybody said, yep, let's do that. And so then, all right, well, let's talk in detail what this website needs to have about it. And so I built a 25-page requirements document that essentially outlines every aspect of the website's functionality. You can see the table of contents here. And this is designed to be detailed enough that I could hand it off to a technology partner and have it serve as a functional specification. So somebody whose job it is to build these kinds of websites from a back-end perspective would be able to read through this and say, okay, I know what pieces of technology need to be put together here. I know how to organize them, and I would know how to build the back end of this thing. From there, we began the UX design process, user experience design process, and much like the building of a house, first you start with the architectural plans, and then you move on to the actual look and feel and the materials of how it is. And so UX design begins with a sitemap, which you kind of saw on the previous screen here, and then the wireframes themselves, essentially black and white mock-ups of what is the content and functionality that needs to be on each page. We designed the website specifically to be mobile friendly, mobile first design it's called, assuming that a large majority and increasingly large majority of people would be accessing this website via their phones. And then once we had all that, we literally sort of described the website, had all of its requirements, and then it was time to build it. And right about then, it became clear that Pix was going to go out of business, unfortunately. And so we realized, okay, well, this was the point at which we had to actually start spending money as an organization. Everything before now was just my sweat, and time, essentially, to get us to this point. But we weren't going to find a developer to do this for free, right? So we had to go out and find some money. So we did a bunch of heavy duty networking. Jancis is not so bad at that sort of thing. And Jackson Family Wines stepped up and said, yep, this sounds like an interesting project. Here's a bunch of money. And it was essentially no strings attached. Barbara Banke came in and thought that this was a good idea, and she wrote us a check, and that was that, which was kind of like, you know, that moment when the clouds open up and the ray of sun comes down from heaven and the strings play in the background. So with that, we knew that we could actually make this thing a reality. I persuaded one of my former employees to create the look and feel of the website in exchange for a couple of cases of wine. I knew she and her husband enjoyed a good bottle of wine. So I said, I'll ship you a couple of cases of really good stuff if you design the site for me, which she did. And then I found a former Sapient colleague in South Africa who actually happened to run a wine-related software company, who knew a whole bunch of technology developers, and he thought he could pull a team of folks together and do it for us and manage the process. So we put the project out to bid. I didn't just sort of hand it to my friend in South Africa. We went and got some competitive bids. My friend in South Africa, Christo, ended up offering a very fair price, and the fact that they knew something about the wine domain, they understood that this was also going to be quite supportive of the South African wine industry, which they were excited about. We decided to use them to build the site. And so we built the site. And so how does it work? So the data itself is stored in a master Google spreadsheet. And that's the thing that allows me to go in and manage it. It's, 3,500 lines or so, with all the different columns. And whenever I need to make an addition or change, I go into the Google spreadsheet and make those changes. In addition, over time, we've built something that we call the Grape Variety Synonym Database, which is a 5,131 line spreadsheet of grape variety names and their synonyms, so that when somebody says that a vineyard is planted with Mataro, and then later someone searches for Monastrell, they get that vineyard that's also got the word Mataro in the grape variety field that it's stored in. So those two things exist in Google spreadsheets, and then that data is exported in tab delimited format and then uploaded to a back office administration panel that we have access to, that sucks it in and pulls it into the Postgres database that we've built that actually runs the site. When people submit data or submit data corrections on the website, that comes to me in the form of an email. I go into that Google Sheet, make whatever changes, re-download the data, and then re-upload the data to the website. So it's a little clunky, but that saves us having to build a whole lot of complicated back office functionality that would allow all this to happen automagically. And frankly, we don't want it to happen automagically because people submit all sorts of junk in the corrections to data, vineyard submissions, and so I need to go through that and actually create it and manage it. So to get to this point, we had to do an awful lot of data cleanup and, more importantly, data standardization. Now, it might not be entirely self-explanatory for everybody about what it takes to go from a sort of a manually managed 1,800 line spreadsheet to a proper database, but just to give you an idea, not all those rows were fully complete with data. Some of them didn't have any vineyard names. Some of them had no vineyard owners. Some of them had no vineyard grape varieties. Some of them were just like, there is a vineyard in the Doro that is 100 years old. Well, that's not particularly useful to anybody. So first we had to delete a whole bunch of data like that. The vineyard age, there was a column called vineyard age, and that contained everything from 36 years to 1976 to more than 100 years ago to planted between 1934 and 1946, and a computer program can't do anything with all that variability of data. And so all those dates had to be converted to 4-year integers, essentially, that would allow the database to search on that. But of course, we knew that some of those were estimates. And so we had to create a new field that indicated whether a date was exact or whether it was estimated. And additionally, many vineyards had only regional classification, partial regional classifications, right? So we might know the DO that a vineyard was in, but have no other data about how that DO nested inside of other classifications, or we might simply know that a vineyard was in Spain, and we might have to go track down exactly what its appellation was. Additionally, one of the core pieces of data that we have here is all the grape varieties that are in a vineyard, and those were conveyed just like the dates. Those were more notes than they were quantitative data that a website could use. So some people would write, there are a lot of different grape varieties in this vineyard, more than 100. A few of them are, right? And a database can't do anything with that. So all those grape variety fields had to be converted to comma-separated lists of those varieties. In addition, there was no data about the producers whatsoever. And this is where ChatGPT ended up being super helpful to me. So I was able to feed a list of hundreds of wine producer names into ChatGPT and have it go off and find the websites for those producers so that we can include the producer's website in the database. Sometimes it hallucinated those websites, so I had to go through and literally check every single one because it was absolutely certain that there was a website for this producer, but in fact there was not. And so we were able to get all that data in there. And in the course of assembling all that data, a number of principles emerged or needed to be enforced or were really required to make this manageable. So the first and most important one, which predated all this work that we did on the website, was what old really means when we're talking about Old Vine Registry. So old for us is 35 years or more. We chose that 35 years for two reasons. Number one, because there's a precedent for that. There are plenty of other old vine organizations and associations around the world that standardize on that 35 years. And so we're kind of putting ourselves in line with those organizations. And one of the reasons that they chose 35 years is that happens to be the average age that vineyards are grubbed up around the world from a commercial perspective, right? So on average, your average commercially focused winery, non-artisan or whatever, is going to rip out its vines every 35 years. And so if it's made it past that 35 years, it's old. Is it ancient? No. But we say 35 years, we survive past that, good on you. You're in your senior years as a grapevine. And so we're saying that's old. We also want more than just one vine in a vineyard to be that old. So while we don't really have any way of enforcing this, we want roughly a third of the vineyard to be vines of that age. Estimation is okay. As I said earlier, we know that people don't always know when a particular vineyard has been planted. I was doing this in English. My foreign language skills are not fabulous. The database was originally, and the spreadsheet was originally created in English. So we're sticking with that for now, hoping that browser translation and AI is helping so that people who do not speak English as their first language will still be able to use the website. We're taking a Wikipedia approach to truth here, which is to say that we're going to start assuming that people are submitting data to us with good intent. We're going to make reasonable efforts to verify that data, and we're going to depend on the wisdom of the crowd to make revisions and updates. Happens all the time, right? I get something from somebody, they send me a vineyard, I put it in there, and then 3 months later, somebody's like, oh, I just read that vineyard was planted in 1937, not in 1939. And so we have to, go back. And sometimes I have to go to the producer themselves and be like, hey, it looks like there are two different dates out there about this vineyard. Which one is correct? We had to create a taxonomy. So all of these vineyards are mapped against their regional official wine hierarchies. We created a 4-level taxonomy, and we have a cheaty way of doing a 5th if we need to do it. So, country, region, sub-region, sub-sub-region, and then if you happen to have a 5th, like places like Paso Robles, or a Rapansi in Greece, you can do a hyphen, and we add a 5th level of hierarchy. So far, we haven't ever needed more than 5, and most places around the world fall into 4. We decided to include photos in the registry, and those pose a particularly thorny problem when it comes to rights management, right? We didn't ever want to be in a situation where somebody was like, well, that's my photo, and I didn't give you permission to have it on the website. I apologize, my dog's barking in the background. We didn't give you permission to have that photo on the website, so you need to take it down. And so the solution for that is to not have the photos on the website. In fact, we're having the photos live on Wikimedia Commons. And one of the benefits of that, in addition to sort of pushing off that hosting to a third party, is also to make sure that the photos are in fact in public domain. So nothing can end up on Wikimedia Commons for very long or stay there without it truly being in the public domain. And that continues to be part of come on in. So you stop barking. Sorry. That continues to be part of the overall ethos we have for the database, which is to say we want all this data to be freely available to everybody. As people submit vineyard information, they're able to put notes about the vineyard, and we've tried to standardize on keeping those focused on the vineyard itself. As you can imagine, a producer comes along, or more often, a person who works in marketing at the vineyard, and they submit information about the vineyard, and they talk about the expansive, rich palate of the wines and how supple the tannins are. We tend to delete that stuff out of the note so that we can focus the data just on the vineyard itself. One of the tricky things becomes, how do you manage discreteness when it comes to a vineyard, right? Vineyards are sometimes made up of multiple blocks. Sometimes those blocks have different grape varieties in them. Sometimes those blocks are planted at different times. And so we have to carefully manage to avoid over proliferation of specificity in the database, right? So if possible, we want one vineyard entry instead of 12 blocks, individual blocks making up that vineyard. The one catch to that is if those blocks are planted at different dates with different grape varieties, we want to capture that difference and that specificity. And so, where possible, we'll consolidate those blocks into a single record, but where necessary, we let them be separate. We've now started listing elevations for vineyards. And so we've chosen the single highest point within the vineyard, although as all of us know, that ends up usually being a range, right? If it's on a slope, it's the bottom of the vineyard's at 230 meters and the top of the vineyard's at 320. But we tend to list 320. We've run into a couple things where people want to obscure the ownership or the exact location of the vineyard for security purposes. It's funny, it ranges all over the place in the world of wine. Some people are incredibly excited to be able to give you a pinpoint on the map where it is and tell you proudly who owns it. And other people are like, oh, I'm not so sure. I want to have my name associated with this vineyard, and I don't really want to know people to know where they are. So we're going to let people keep those separate if they want to, and keep those obscure. Sometimes there are no names for vineyards. Sometimes it just happens to be this person's vineyard. And so we default to the owner's name if there's no specific proper name that has been given for a vineyard. And lastly, with a couple exceptions, and I'll actually show you some of these exceptions, a vineyard has to be more than just a handful of vines, right? We want this to actually be a vineyard plot as opposed to a couple old vines that you happen to discover, in the bushes beside your vineyard that are particularly old. I don't think I'm going to sort of bore you with all the details of the specific data that we're capturing. I'll leave it up here for a moment and just let you know that these are kind of the fields of the database, so to speak, that we're capturing. And that over time, we've had some contributions from some large organizations. So we got a big dump at one point of 600 plus Doro vineyards, likewise from Importa and Moldova. Armenia stepped up and gave us a whole bunch of stuff. Even though we had a bunch of these vineyards already, we reconciled our data with the California Historic Vineyard Society. And so now there's a one-to-one mapping in our database to their database. We got a bunch from Penedès, and the Lodi wine growers again stepped up, and we made sure that we aligned and had all of their historic vineyards in the database as well. Couple things I've learned along the way in doing this. Taxonomy, oh my God, such a royal pain, especially because sources of truth for these things are not easy to come by without native language skills. So it literally took me, I don't know what, 15 hours to work out what the actual proper nested classifications scheme was for the vineyards of Cyprus, because it's not like there's a Wines of Cyprus website that tells you all that. And if you go out and you find sources like Wine Folly or things like that, they all conflict. They all got different names. And so trying to hunt down, what those regional classifications are and how they nest is really, really tricky. Producers, no matter how many times we say it and how explicit we are on the website, are not clear about the difference between when a vineyard was first planted and the actual age of the living vines within it. So we get plenty of, oh yeah, this vineyard 17 is dated to 1774. And we're like, well, no, probably not. You mean that's when it was first planted with vines? How old are the vines now? So there's a lot of back and forth that we have to do with people submitting vineyards at that point, especially in some of the old world regions with great patrimony, right? And of course, vine age is a tricky business in general, because you don't plant a vineyard once, right? You plant a vineyard over time, and the average age of a vineyard ends up changing over time in ways that we can't really keep track of, because this vine dies and you replace it and things like that. So we're muddling through the way that people do, and try and work with people and make sure we're asking sharp questions to understand what we're talking about when it comes to given vineyard composition. There are a lot of people out there in the world, a lot of organizations out there in the world that have data about these vineyards, but getting it from them is an awful lot harder than you might think. And in some cases, it's actually illegal, which is kind of preposterous. But the laws are such in South Africa that the Old Vine Project of South Africa, which keeps track of all the old vineyards, all vineyards older than 35 years in South Africa, is unable by law to give us the list of those vineyards. For whatever reason, their charter as an organization and its relationship to the government prevents them from giving us that quote unquote private information about the vineyards, which means they have to send out emails to their producers saying, hey guys, it would be a great idea if you sent all your information over here to the Old Vine Registry people, which of course wine producers are quite often far too busy to do or not organized well enough to do. So it's like we're steps away, like we can barely reach these amazing gold mines of data, and yet they're off limits to us, right? The Chateauneuf-du-Pape is another example, right? I mean, how many thousands of old vine vineyards are there in Chateauneuf-du-Pape? And I keep asking, and they're like, look, really, we can't. We're not allowed to release that information. So it's quite frustrating, but we're finding ways around that when we can, and using brute force when we can. This database is only as useful as the cleanliness of its data, which is why I'm dwelling so long on all the machinations that we went through to get everything clean and standardized, so that it can actually be searched by people. So just a couple interesting things about the vineyard. Thank you for bearing with me as I went through all the nitty-gritty, which I hope was of interest at least to some of you. Here are some of our oldest vineyards. We've got some up to 600 years old. You can take that with whatever grain of salt you want, right? We got some estimates here. That Von Racknitz vineyard apparently is quite interesting. It's only a few vines. Those vines still bear fruit, and apparently they taste absolutely awful, kind of like spoiled cucumber. But they are purportedly 600 years old. There's a house in Slovenia, in Maribor, that's completely encased with one or more old vines. That's pretty clearly dated 400 or so years. There's the Rote Rosengarten in Germany, that's also around the same age. A vineyard of unknown name in Georgia around the same age. And then some in Italy and Armenia, 300, 324. And then we get into the kind of the pedestrian 200-year-old vines farther down if I were to scroll, but I can't because this is a screenshot. Some interesting facts and mysteries that have evolved or that I've discovered in the data so far. The vast majority of old vine vineyards in Moldova are planted to Isabella. Isabella, of course, is a hybrid of Labrusca and Vitis vinifera that is supposed to be a spontaneous hybrid. It was quote unquote discovered in the early 1800s in the United States. And who knows how that got to Moldova and why it is the majority of the old vine plantings in Moldova, but that is what it is. Likewise, all the data that we got from the Doro, this big dump of data of 600 plus vineyards, by far, and you can see the chart on the right, by far the planting dates most common for those vines are 1930 or 1931 and 1970. That should look in most universes much more like a standard distribution of data. But you see these two huge spikes in 1930 and 1970. I've tried to investigate this personally and talked with a bunch of producers and long-standing people in Portugal. And as best they can guess, this has to do something with just government bureaucracy. Like those were the years that certain registries were established. And so anything that was unknown at that time got coded as 1930 or 1970. But nobody has actually given me a definitive answer about this yet. So that's an ongoing mystery as to why that is. Average age in the database is 79, median age 69. A lot of places in the world where we have just literally one or two vineyards. Kazakhstan, Georgia, Switzerland, Serbia, China, Bulgaria, Brazil, and a whole bunch of places that we know grow vine grapes that we have no representation from, whether that's Czech Republic or Morocco or Ukraine or Slovakia. The synonym project was sort of its own little thing that I worked on for quite a long time. It's not nearly as complete as something like, wine grapes that sits on your shelf is, but it's pretty solid at 5,000 synonyms. And the one with the most is Muscat Blanc à Petit Grain, 76 different names for that grape in our database. Speaking of grape varieties, we've got 591 individual ones represented, although some of those are synonyms. The most represented grape varieties are Zinfandel, Isabella, Areni, and Carignan. And that has less to do with being an accurate description of like what the old vine distribution is in the world and more about just the chunks of data that we've received, right? So we got a whole bunch of vineyards from California that gave us Zinfandel. We got a whole bunch of vineyards from Moldova that gave us Isabella. We got a bunch from Armenia. That's why Areni is prevalent. And then Carignan is planted in lots of places from, South Africa to, Chile to France to California, right? So Shiraz, Cabernet, Pinot, Grenache, Riesling, and Chardonnay are the remaining most popular grapes. And then we've got a whole bunch that appear only once. Hopefully we can change that, right? There should be more than one vineyard with Blaufränkisch on there. But then a bunch of other really exotic sounding grapes, 80% of which, probably most of us have never heard of in our lives. A few interesting vineyards just to finish up here before I open it up to questions. I love this vineyard. So this is a vineyard in Turkey that spreads over 1,980 hectares, right? 4,893 acres. And you're like, what? How can it be that big? Well, what it is it's actually trees that have vines planted next to them, and the vines are trained up into the trees, and this huge swath of forest is that large, and it's farmed by about 120 households, and 774 people for hundreds of years have farmed this forest essentially, where the grapes are deliberately planted next to these trees. And then the grapes are all collected and put together and made into a sort of a collective wine from all these different highland villages in the Bodrum Peninsula in Turkey. So it's a super cool project. Similarly, there's this Caldera vineyard in the Sinti Valley of Bolivia, where all the vines grow up into trees and people climb the trees every year to harvest. And I know, I don't know if Neon Gouda is a member of the Circle of Wine Writers, but some of you have probably heard of his project where he goes down every year and makes wine from Bolivian vineyards. A fairly classic old vine, one of the older ones that we've got from Australia, Killicannoon Atunga vineyard. I love the photo of that vine. And then I'd mentioned that we have a couple singular vines in the database. This is one where this is actually my photo of this incredibly old vine on the hill of Shomlo. About back behind Apachagi winery, estimated to be about 225 years old, and nobody quite knows what the grape variety is. They believe it's Zamatovka. I've tasted wine made from this vine, and to me, it tastes like Labrusca grape variety. It's a little foxy, so I think it might be an American grape or a hybrid of some sort. But that's that vineyard on the left, and then this 401-year-old vine in Maribor that's super famous and happens to be listed in the Guinness Book of World Records as the oldest noble vine in the world, still bearing grapes. Again, take that with a grain of salt, but if Guinness says it's true, it must be true, right? So to finish up, what does all this mean for you as wine writers? So firstly, I hope it's a place that you can come increasingly with great usefulness and research vineyards that you happen to be writing about. I hope it is also a place that you will consider contributing facts about vineyards you're visiting. I mean, I don't know if you're like me, but we go on a press trip, or we go visiting, we visit a producer and they tell us all about their wines and we're taking furious notes. And we're invariably capturing information that could appear here in the Old Vine Registry, in terms of who owns the vineyard and how big is it and when was it planted and what grape varieties does it contain and stuff like that. And I hope that you'll make note of that information and spend a couple minutes. Really, it doesn't take long to come on and submit that information to the database. First, you got to search and see if it's already there. But then if it's not, to submit that information so we can continue to grow the resource that is the Old Vine Registry. It's also a place that increasingly you should be able to do metadata research on in a given industry or section of the industry, right? So you want to find out what's going on in Armenia with old vines. We've now got a really solid chunk of data there. You want to go and see all that Isabella in Moldova and be like, what's going on there? You can go and you can research that also with the Doro. Maybe you want to pick a project, and maybe let's say you want to figure out, how did all that Isabella get to Moldova? Well, maybe you start your own Indiana Jones hunt to discover why Isabella ended up in Moldova, and that becomes a jumping off point for a story that you get paid richly for in some magazine like The World of Fine Wine or something like that. And then eventually, as we get more and more of them, this is going to start to become a really interesting repository of public domain images of old vine vineyards, which, of course, we can all use to illustrate our work and to showcase the amazing nature of these old vine vineyards. So where are we headed as a site? We've established this goal of registering 10,000 vineyards by 2027. We're at, 3 and change now, so we got a long way to go. And we started a contest with fabulous prizes in addition to fame and glory for people who submit the most vineyards. So if you're interested, I'm happy to tell you more about that. Or you can go on to the Old Vine Registry website and click through, and we've got an explanation of that Heritage Vine Hunt contest. We're out there looking for our own Stephen Pruitt. I don't know if you guys know who that is, but he's the guy who's edited Wikipedia like 3 million times and is sort of responsible for 85% of what is in Wikipedia in the English language. So we're looking for people like that. And we found one. There's a neurologist named Thomas Riedel, who has got the most definitive set of information about old vine vineyards in Germany that exists out there. And so I'm working with him to gradually get his data into the database. But we need 15 or 20 Thomas Riedels. We need one for Châteauneuf-du-Pape. We need one for some, pick your wine region around the world. We're also learning how people are using the registry and what they're searching for, so that we can sort of get information about what people are interested in. And then we're raising funds to drive the next phase of development, which we hope can start to integrate maps. So you can, be on a page looking at a vineyard, you can see a map of where it is. We can start building and aggregating statistics about what we've got in the database. I want to build an advanced search so that you can search more parametrically as opposed to just keywords on the site. Maybe if we have enough images, just let you browse. Like, okay, show me old vine vineyards. And you can sort of just click through from one to the other and see pretty pictures and see a bit of information about the vineyards, et cetera, et cetera. So lots of ideas for how to make this thing bigger and better. And I just want to underscore the fact that this is an entirely volunteer effort. We have a lot of ground to cover, quite literally, but it's something that you can do from the comfort of your own home office. I have an endless list of projects that I'm ready to assign to anybody who wants them. So if you've got some extra time and you wouldn't mind helping us out, I can get you off doing Google research on specific vineyards. I can give you a list of Old Vine wines from Cellar Tracker to go off and validate, how old the vines are, et cetera, et cetera. I can have you reach out to wine marketing associations from different regions to see if they'd be willing to give us data. There's data cleanup. Right now, we have all these Burgundy vineyards listed, and we don't actually have cru designations on them, which we would like to have. So somebody would have to go through and say, okay, well, this particular vineyard in Gevrey-Chambertin, is it Premier Cru? Is it Grand Cru? And then, we can correct that information. There's research on individual wines that I happen to be are made with old vines, but I don't know anything about the vineyard, much, much more. And in particular, if you have good French, Spanish, German, Italian, or other Euro language skills, that's really helpful, especially when it comes to outreach to these wine marketing associations. So if you're interested, please reach out, oldvineregistry@gmail.com. I will happily, thankfully, gratefully put you to work. And there's much glory and renown to be gained for doing that, even if there's no pecuniary remuneration. So that's the end of my thing. Let me stop sharing so we can all see each other's faces, and I will happily take questions as long as you're not stunned into silence by the crazy amount of detail I've given.
Thank you very much, Alder. I think everybody is stunned, actually, and probably taking breath. I'm surprised you don't take breath as well. I mean, the complexity of what you've done already is amazing, and the task ahead is almost daunting, but hopefully you'll generate some help along the way. But you have generated some questions. Can I ask Neil to unmute himself, because he started off with a couple of questions there? You're still there, Neil?
Yeah, I'm here. I think you sort of answered it indirectly, but here in the Willamette Valley, the oldest Pinot vines were planted in 65, 66, the Irie Vineyard, and I was wondering if anybody had reached out and asked them to post in the registry. It would seem to be a natural. I saw that you have the David Hill, which is the second oldest. So
Yeah.
do you do this actively, or you're just waiting for them to kind of show up?
Well, as you can imagine, if you take that single individual case, Neil, there are probably 946,342 examples of that around the world, right?
Yeah.
So there's only so much that we can do proactively. So this is a perfect case of like, Neil Hochauer, wine writer, Oregon, knows that there's a vineyard that exists, that it should be in the registry, that isn't. Like, take 2 minutes, shoot me an email with the details about the vineyard, and poof, it gets in the registry. That's by far the easiest way for that to happen, because we can't possibly reach out to all these producers. What we can do is we can send an email to the Oregon Wine Marketing Board, which we have, saying, we encourage you to encourage your members to get their the stuff in the database. But beyond that, and beyond sort of like individual personal interests that I take because I happen to be standing at the winery and say, hey, could I get your information to put in the database? It's got to be people like you doing that. So
sure. Yeah, I'll do it. But do you need the permission of the vineyard owner to post? I mean,
so that's an interesting and great question. So number one, much of this data, the winery is already making public on their own website, or is well established in the public domain, right? So you could go and Google, some article that is about the history of the Irie Vineyard that lists that information. So all that information is in the public domain, and therefore public for us. The situation may arise, however, where that information is not public, and you have to solicit that from the producer. And in that case, I think it's reasonable to ask their permission to add it to the database, and especially if you want to have their name associated with it. As I mentioned earlier, on occasion we do get producers who are like, I own this vineyard, but I don't want my name associated with it. I'm happy to have it in the database, but I don't want it to be known that some famous musician owns this vineyard. I just want it to, have the name of the vineyard and have that be in there. So use your discretion there, but public domain is fair game as far as we're concerned. And it only benefits them and the rest of the wine industry to have that data collected in the database, in particular because on every vineyard page, there's a button that says buy wines from this vineyard, which presumably every, producer wants to have happen, right?
Yeah. A related question. I work at a winery that has some old vines, White Rose, in the top of the Dundee Hills. Those vineyards were planted between 78 and 81, but they have phylloxera. They've been ripping them out and replanting. What's going to happen when they rip the whole thing out? I mean, if I'll propose them as well for inclusion, but
Yep.
what's going to happen down the line?
Somebody's going to come along and be like, hey, Alder, that vineyard was ripped out in 2025, so it shouldn't be in the database anymore, and we'll take it out. That's already happened several times in California. There was a beautiful old vine mixed blacks vineyard that Silver Oak owned in the Alexander Valley. And somebody said to me the other day, I'm not so sure that vineyard exists anymore. And I called up Silver Oak, and sure enough, they had ripped it out and replanted it to Cabernet. So it happens. And that's both the downside of something like this, but also the benefit of crowdsourcing, right? Is that those corrections get to be made over time, just like Wikipedia, right? And somebody dies and they go in and put in the death date in Wikipedia. Probably won't happen quite as quickly in the Old Vine Registry, but we're hoping similar things will happen.
Thank you.
Thank you, Neil. Meg Maker, our chairman, has got a quick question. Over to you, Meg.
Thanks, Alder. I hear you making pleas for data and data support and help. And I actually am seeing in the chat a lot of people saying, I'm happy to volunteer. I have skills very similar to yours in terms of IA, UX, taxonomy. Are you still in need of volunteers with those more like design skills? Or are you really strictly looking for people who are chasing accuracy?
For now, it's chasing accuracy, chasing data, right? Now, there's, as you know, Meg, there's kind of like a gray area between sort of information architecture, information science, like structuring data. That's a particular exercise in addition to sort of research and digging things up. And I certainly do need both, right? I've got I'm about to get a whole set of data from the VDP, right, about vineyards, and it's kind of a mess. And so somebody needs to go through and like structure it and make sure it's all consistent and stuff like that. So some of those skills, but there's nothing in terms of like actually designing pages yet or anything like that we need help with. Mostly it's research and kind of like beating the streets. And we have a call into the Vini Wachau organization, who's like expressed some interest in potentially having their members vineyards in the database, but like the last email I sent them, I had to do it in English. There's not really been any response. So like somebody who can speak German who wants to go and like hammer them and be like, hey guys, this would be a great thing to do. Let's talk about this. If you have any questions, I can answer them in German, kind of thing, is super helpful.
Yeah, thanks. I can help with some of that like data normalization, standardization stuff on an ad hoc basis. So we could just be in touch about that. Thank you.
Okay, thanks, Meg. Michelle has a quick question.
Yeah, Alder, when you were talking about registering this sort of single, wanting to register a block as a single entry, what if the block is owned or it's a single vineyard like in Piedmont? There's so many producers who have a bit of a single old vineyard. What happens there?
Piedmont, Etna, Burgundy, right? So everybody's got their chunk of a given climat or a thing. Essentially, we register them by producer, right? So we've got, Guardiola, Pietradolce, and we have Guardiola Passo Pisciaro, and they're two separate listings with the specific hectares that each of those producers have in that given vineyard. And if there's enough difference, like if one of them's on the top of the vineyard, one's in the bottom of the difference vineyard, the elevation can be different. The vine age can also be different. So we want to capture that level of specificity for two reasons. One, because the ownership is in fact different and somebody might replant or do something different with their section of the vineyard. And two, because we want to send people to buy both of those wines, right? Like Guardiola is this really big vineyard and there are a lot of people who make wines from them. We want to have everybody have the opportunity to get attention for their particular section.
Perfect. Thank you very much.
The next question was from Liz Saggis.
Whoop, you're still on mute there, Liz.
Okay. while Liz is just, her initial question was what proportion of entries are non-vinifera?
Oh, I would have to do a very careful search against probably a grape variety name in order to do that. I would guess it's fairly low. But I don't think I would even hazard to give you a specific percentage. I think the majority of stuff that we've got is vinifera because I think we're focused on the wine world primarily, and I think the value of old vines in the wine world tends to be very focused on vinifera. So some small single-digit percentage, maybe. I don't know.
Okay. Does anybody else have any other questions? Otherwise, we'll ask Michelle to hand over to.
I would like just to ask something about the Doro. We talked about the Doro and how I'm based in Portugal, and I know the Doro very well. And a lot of the very old vineyards sometimes have 35, 40 varieties and more. Most of them are not individually identified yet. Some producers are making this effort, but this involves a lot of logistics and a lot of work to be done. So in this case, and I'm one of the persons that said I would volunteer for sure. I'm fluent in 5 languages, so I think it could be a help for you, not only in Portuguese, but in Italian or Spanish or French or English, whatever. But it's with cases like this where you have so many grapes in a vineyard. How do you approach this? If they say, okay, I have a vineyard with 80 years old, but we don't know yet which varieties. How do you approach this?
Yeah, so the Doro is a great example of this, and of course it exists in California and elsewhere around the world as well. So I think in my experience is that many producers, Joanna, in the Doro, they know 8 or 10 or 12, right? So they say, well, we know there's a lot of Touriga Franca, there's a lot of Touriga Nacional, there's a lot of Tinta Roriz, there's a lot of Tinta Cao, there's a little bit of Susao, there's a little Alicante Boucher, there's a little bit of this, and then there's like 25 other things. And
Right.
so we will list as many of those varieties as a producer knows. And sometimes it is a list of 25 or 30. And then oftentimes we will just include the phrase field blend in that so that you can actually search the database for field blends if you want and find those kinds of vineyards. There's actually a whole bunch of those in Germany I'm finding, thanks to this guy, this neurologist, Thomas Riedel. So we try and list as many as we can because at some point, right, somebody is going to come searching for, wow, I wonder if there are any vineyards in the world that have the super obscure grape variety of Alicante Branca Forsato or whatever. I just made that up, right? And so, but if somebody happens to know that's in the vineyard and we've got it listed in that long comma separated list of grape varieties, I want them to be able to find that vineyard. So we get explicit as we can, and then we know that there are a bunch of vineyards that are just field blend, and we might get more specific later on.
This is so exciting. Thank you so much for this, and thank you for the circle to organize this. And I'm an anxiety, but it's just amazing to see it.
Well, send me an email, Joanna, and I will put you to work.
I will.
3 volunteers from a specimen of 23 of us. That's not too bad, I don't suppose, is it? So
yes, well, so I got Meg, I got Joanna. Who else is volunteering?
And well, Neil. And
I'm doing it continuously in Italy.
Yes.
Okay, over to you.
Anyway, so yes, I'll wrap up and thank you so much, Alder, for this fascinating and geeky presentation and for all your commendable dedication to Old Vines. I think you gave us so many convincing reasons as to why to support the Old Vine Registry and interesting facts on the importance of the registry. So I'm sure many members will spread the word across the globe and hopefully get involved. And